I vividly remember a scuffle on a cricket field as a university student. A bowler mumbled something to a batting partner who was a burly Sri Lankan. He was incensed, dropped his bat and started walking threateningly to the bowler. "You called me a black prick," he shouted. This energised everybody. My teammates started walking out onto the field in support. The bowler stood firm defensively, shook his head and retorted, "Don't call me a racist. I didn't call you a black prick. I called you a fat prick." The tension eased, much laughter followed, although my batting partner was still annoyed and left red-faced. A couple of things this encounter underlined. First, race is an emotionally charged topic, and not one easy to debate rationally. It touches on our primitive urges, an innate suspicion of difference. We make unconscious judgments based on race, looks, or height every day. Second, minority groups are often sensitised to seeing racism when it may not be there. As a result, it's often a simplistic charge that belies the complexity of human motives. Finally, it seems calling someone fat or a prick, or even a fat prick, was far more preferable than calling them black. The term racism is used in a loose way to describe the hostile feelings of one ethnic group to another. This group-centred prejudice and snobbery is an almost universal human failing. Now, the climax of the history of racism came in the 20th century, when the antipathy one group felt to another reached a single-mindedness and brutality unprecedented. The Nazis, apartheid, and the American South were some of the worst examples, where a racial, religious, or ethnic group was seen as having unchangeable, inferior traits. Its prelude was a century of colonialism, the conquests of empire, and the notion of the white man's burden to civilise the lesser peoples of the non-white world. What makes this racism so conspicuous is that it developed in a context that presumed human equality of some kind, an idea that remains a novel in most parts of the world. First came the doctrine of Christian believers all equal before God, and later the more revolutionary concept that all men are born free and equal and entitled to equal rights in society and government. The logic of racism was derived from the West, where it was also being identified, condemned, and resisted from within the same cultural tradition. This debate begins with the assumption that Australia shares this racist past of our cultural ancestry. There's much evidence to support this, as you've heard, from the Founding Act to exclude Melanesian and Chinese labour, to the treatment of Aborigines, to our fear of Asian or Japanese invasion. What this debate really depends upon is how we define escaped. You've heard from my teammates a story of a country that, despite lacking a grand mythology and having an isolated, barren geography, but is still one that has developed into one of the most successful and diverse countries in the world. Some of the measures that indicate this are social mobility, rates of mixed marriage, and our immigration rates. We are one of the most desirable nations to emigrate to. Incidentally, I enjoyed hearing Dr. Aurora's account of difficulties wearing turbans and bike helmets. We've all heard of the burkini, an innovative attempt to conquer traditional mores with modern lifestyles. Perhaps somebody could try manufacturing a more convenient turban. I was thinking of a combination of a beanie and a turban. It could be called a bourbon, which would go very nicely with Australian culture indeed. You've heard from our opponents that despite our clear success on some levels, there is a lurking underbelly of prejudice that requires only a minor spark to be set ablaze, be it from conservative leaders, world events, or economic deprivation. Professor Mahan argues that our response to asylum seekers reflects an underlying racism, now in the form of Islamophobia. We heard from Professor Birrell that it's more complex than that it touches on a deep sense of fairness and community among all Australians, including many migrant groups. Terrorism has upped the prejudice towards Muslims across the globe, and there is nothing like TV images to trigger emotional responses. One that isn't so easily felt for the tens of thousands of other Muslims from Asia, the Middle East and Africa who quietly come off the plane and walk through customs. We remain relatively unique in that the majority of our Muslim migration, other than Lebanese refugees in the late 70s, enter the workforce and watch their children rise up the social ladder with the ease that my teammates have outlined. And on this, I will make the point that the race riots were more a conflict of urban tribes fighting over territory. It had more to do with class than some underlying racial divide. White working class youth fueled by alcohol against a group of kind of marginalised Lebanese youth. I contend that our antipathy towards asylum seekers is one most people hold with considerable ambivalence and is not fundamentally tied to a racist past, but more a feature of modern trends, the dominance of TV images, terrorism and globalisation. The attacks on Indian students are another example of events where simplistic charges of racism fail to illuminate the complexities of human motives. They were likely to be as much acts of opportunism from desperate predators as they were related to race. In fact, Gautam almost proved the point for me. The attacks were against specifically Indian students and not the broader group of Indians, which suggests that this group was more vulnerable. They worked odd hours, they often lived in areas of greater crime rates. Indeed, some of the attackers were suspected of being heroin addicts. Why is it that Melbourne, arguably Australia's most progressive city, became the eye of the storm when it came to student attacks? While Victoria may attract the highest number of students, the attacks remain disproportionate and suggest some local factors, such as law enforcement, were also contributors, as well as the vulnerable lifestyles that many students lead. Note, Victoria has fewer police per capita than any other Australian state. Now, I also suggest something about the monoculture, which Gautam was trying to allude to a broader racism. As someone who, I guess, has straddled a more traditional, say, an ethnic profession of being a doctor, while trying to also work in the media, I can tell it's far more complex than that. Often, children of ethnic groups do not choose those professions. The average child of an Indian is not dreaming of becoming the police chief. They're thinking of careers in medicine, engineering or business, this kind of thing. So it's a lot more layers of complexity than mere charges of racism. A quick note about the Indigenous problem. As someone who has worked as a young doctor in Aboriginal communities in the Northern Territory, I saw the complete failure of many of the policies championed by the likes of Professor Mann, be it no strings attached welfare or forms of cultural relativism. The more recent policies of greater individual responsibility and modified paternalism that Professor Mann would attribute to our racist past, I would attribute to utter frustration at the failure of past ideas to develop and rehabilitate a people stripped of their historical symbols and traditions. There is no question that racial prejudice exists. Surveys over the past decade suggest half of us think Muslims behave strangely, that we admit to low levels of racial prejudice, and many of us don't want our children to marry people of other ethnic groups. But clearly, as we've heard, particularly from Professor Birrell, the reality on the ground is that we've already been swamped by Asian hordes, myself included, where many of your children, God forbid, have married outside their ethnic groups, and there is little evidence of broader institutional barriers to climb the social ladder for ethnic or religious groups. Nothing comparable to the far-right parties of Europe have had any lasting success here, and nor will they. Pauline Hanson was a blip on our political radar. As our team of enlightened, optimistic go-getters highlight and underline the folly of our self-flagellating, cultural cringing opponents, we've well and truly escaped our racist past.